Hello. This is Amy. I'm coming to you from beautiful Northern California, the place where the place I'm calling home for at least the coming several months. I am here with another report/update on what I'm kind of cheekily, but also feels really real to me, describing as my living sociological experiment with walking out of systems of oppression, as much as it's possible to do that in this day and age. I've been talking about this theme for a long time, this notion of walking out to walk on. What does it look like when we leave behind things that don't work and enter new opportunities, enter new spaces, try new things? I've had a lot of inspirations along my journey, but that particular phrase comes from the book Walk Out, Walk On, a learning journey into communities daring to live the future now. That's a book by Deborah Fries and Meg Wheatley. All of the systems that we live within right now, most of them, if not all of them, have been created through the colonizer lens, right? Have been created through value systems that are in adherence to white settler colonization, to capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy. So this notion of communities being an epicenter of social change is different than what we've been taught to envision by this top-down society. I can recognize from my previous role, I really held a mentality for a long time that we had to start with policies, we had to start with systems, we had to start with these institutions, and then that would trickle down. And I've reversed my thinking on that over the years, through experience, through readings, through coming into contact with other people. And I too have bought into this notion of community as being this epicenter of us when we come together and create containers where we can be our true human selves. That's when we can start to move beyond some of these systems and ways of being that we often are unconsciously replicating, even though we don't want to, just because we're so entrenched in it. That's an analogy that I have used when I teach institutional oppression is you can think about it as a fishbowl analogy, you can think about it as a smog, but it's this kind of pervasive cover around us that until we consciously look at it, we might not even recognize that we're embedded in smog. If we're raised in smog and that's all we've known, we come to think of that as natural and normal, even though it doesn't have to be. Same with the fishbowl, right? Like the goldfish only knows that the fishbowl is the world, but that's not the full world, right? There's a lot that goes beyond that. What I realized as I was teaching about social problems and spending a lot of my time thinking about social problems and the way they're replicated in society, of course, I started to see more and more of the ways that I myself was engaging in practices, belief systems, participating in systems that supported the institutions that were inflicting oppression and marginalization, that are inflicting oppression upon all of us. I also realized that we just don't get a lot of examples of what it looks like to do something different, right? At least that was my experience in Omaha, Nebraska. And what that does is if we only see the way the world is around us, it prevents us from even exploring other possibilities, right? It prevents us from even opening ourselves to new possibilities, to the idea that there could be new possibilities, new ways of doing things. And that's a lot of what I experienced was kind of an inability to really visualize what a society could look like beyond the society that I was embedded within, which didn't feel good to me, didn't feel right to me. There were issues that I saw everywhere, personally and professionally, working as a social worker for a decade in Omaha. I felt a lot like I was kind of perpetually spinning my wheels, trying to take away chips at something that was a lot bigger than I could even wrap my head around. And that's the point where I think a lot of us can get stuck, is this feeling of like, I don't even know where to start. The problem seems so big. I'm only this tiny little cog in a wheel. What kind of a difference can I make? How can I be someone who stands out and does something different when all the systems and institutions around me are embedded the ways that they are in our society? When my job has to look a certain way, when my house has to look a certain way, when the way I live has to look a certain way, when the way I love has to look a certain way. It can be really hard to break out of those constraints when we don't see examples of what else there is. A big part of the reason why I'm doing this and why I'm making videos and really trying to openly share about my experience of living this experience of walking out and then seeking something else to walk onto, even though maybe I don't even have a clear, because I didn't even have a clear image of what that was going to look like when I began this journey. I've been planning this journey for the last 2 years at least. Began it back in August of 2020, officially departed Omaha then. And so I want to give myself as an example of this. I want to offer my experience and share really as vulnerably and authentically as I can about what it's been like for me, because I know what it feels like to be in a place where you can envision something different and it can feel stuck. It can feel trapped. It can feel hopeless. And I want to encourage anyone who's feeling that way. This isn't a rash decision to make. This isn't something to jump into. That's also why I'm making these videos, is I want to candidly share what it's like. But there are other options. There are other options. There are other ways to go. There are other experiences you can have. There are people who are living things differently. We need all kinds of people to fill all kinds of roles. They talk about that in Walk Out, Walk On too. We need people to stay in institutions and systems that aren't working well. We need people to stay and do their best to influence those systems and institutions from the inside. So, this isn't for everyone. But it's for some of us. It's been a little while since I've made a video. A lot of things have been happening in my world and I've been living this, right? Like I've been living these experiences myself and learning along the way. So there's a big, van life is a whole thing online. Nomad living is a whole thing online. There's a lot of people who have been increasingly interested in off-the-grid living or being able to travel and work electronically, especially with the pandemic. That opened up a lot of opportunities for people to do so. I've been able to do that. I'm still teaching part-time online now, and so I'm able to travel and be wherever I am and still have some of that financial support coming in for me. Last July, that was this July, I spent a couple weeks actually where I'm at right now, and I was helping with a queer land project. So that's the land that I'm living on right now. It's a queer land project, and helping them with some of the maintenance. It's a camping and retreat center that I'm staying at, although there's some changes and fluctuations happening. So I was helping with a lot of that kind of support. This land project has existed for 7 years with the intention of providing a space for queer intentional community with an emphasis on connecting to nature. Creativity and spirituality are really big elements here. I had the opportunity to return here because this land is in transition. The founder of the project recently passed away, and there was already wheels in motion to bring in some new stewards of the land, bring in a new group to oversee this project. So there's a referral or an application process that's happening right now, an RFP process if you are working in the nonprofit world. And there's a group of people who will oversee this transition. So there's a handful of us who are staying on this property right now. As I mentioned, it's a retreat center, so it's mostly closed down, it's mostly shut down. But there's a small handful of us. There's 4 of us who are permanently staying here during this time period of the transition before the new folks come on board, before whoever decides to continue this land project is able to move through that process. And we have, different fluctuating folks coming through here. Right now, there's another person who's living here in addition to the 4 of us. An elder Indigenous person who lives in the area who needed some sanctuary due to some personal life crises. So it's definitely my most immersive experience living in intentional community where I'm in my van, and then we have a shared primary house space that has a kitchen and bathroom and facilities and heat and all those pieces. The property is quite large here. There's a residential side and a campsite and all kinds of buildings and a lot of different cabins. So it's a very large property to care for and maintain. That's part of what our role is during this time period. But it's a very different living experience from anything that I've ever been used to. And for me, is a huge opportunity to learn a lot more about what does it look like to build cohesively as community. You know, I think a lot of people, I think especially a lot of queer people, have this vision of like queer utopia, right? Like a lot of us hold this vision of like a queer utopia of a land, or we talk about buying an island and moving all our friends out there, and we hold this image of what would it look like to exist in a space that felt free. I think that really is what it boils down to, and I think that's something that can be a lot more universal than just for queer folks. We all want to feel free. We all want to be able to show up and be our truest, most authentic selves, and have that be accepted and be loved and cherished for that. Do you see my furball roommate? Her name is Frightful. She's one of my land roomie's cats. So, you know, I think that is a vision that a lot of us share is what would it look like to create a community of loving support. And we can think about this in terms of family units, we can think about this in terms of geographical spaces, we can think about this in terms of expanding our lens of community, nomadic circles, or other sort of identity categories. Really, that's a lot of what brought me to choose to come here during this time period to be one of these longer term land stewards. To help support this space during this transition is in part, you know, alignment with some of my visions and personal identities. And, you know, me personally wanting to experience what does it feel like to exist in a space where people aren't so constrained by the social constructs of gender and sexual orientation and heteronormativity. But then also to see what does it look like to sustainably exist in community? And a lot of that boils down to like, how do we get along? You know, I was reflecting on what are the kind of main points I want to talk about in terms of lessons that I'm learning. And the first I've kind of touched on already, which is like, walking out is hard, y'all. Like, walking out is hard. It has been a long process. If you've been following my videos, you've seen me talk a lot about fear, more recently about grief and loss, and there's so much of that when walking out of something, right? And this is something I knew. I can think back to my early social work education days, and learning about times of transition are often the hardest for us, and leaving behind anything, walking out of anything, a relationship, a job, a career, a family dynamic, a behavioral pattern, a belief system, like walking out of anything is emotional labor. It's an emotional process. There's a loss that comes with walking out of anything. You know, it's a tough thing. There's a deconstruction process that happens. For me, there's been a deconstruction process that has happened of having to let go of all of these previous identity categories that I built for myself, and ways that I had built the world to be for myself and for people around me. And again, there's just been a lot of loss that's come with that, a lot of tangible loss, and a lot of sort of emotional loss of having to go through those layers of like, okay, this is not me, this maybe was never me, and so having to let those ideas go is hard. Having to adjust to new things is hard. I can recognize that there was a really strong time period of feeling fear about my walk-on process. And then it's been morphed into more of that grief and loss time period. And, you know, that was kind of a theme throughout. Leaving Omaha was really hard. I'd never lived anywhere other than Omaha. I had lived in the house I just sold this summer for 14 years of my life. So I was really rooted, embedded, used to things being a certain way. So there's been loss all along. I can reflect back over this time period and see that that's definitely become a more prominent theme for me as the fear sort of dissipated. So as I was able to work through some of those fears of survival-based fears or just letting things go, then comes kind of the emotional reaction of like, oh, I did take that leap of faith. I did make that decision to end this relationship, to leave this place, to XYZ. And then it brings up those feelings of the grief, the loss, and having to sit with that, process that through, not run from it, right? Like none of us want to feel those things, but the things that we don't allow ourselves to feel, they stay stuck in our bodies. So we got to feel them, y'all. We got to feel them. And that can take a really long time, but it is a process. It is a grief process. And I think it's important we allow ourselves to go through those. But the other part of that is relearning relationships. And it's been interesting to me that like that's been such a focus of this notion of community for me. Coming together in sustainable community is again a lot of emotional labor that makes sense to me. I could have thought ahead and been like, oh yeah, like that's going to be a challenge. And I knew that about myself. I knew there were things that were going to challenge me for sure. I would say that I did not realize the extent to which like living intentionally in community with others, not just, I mean, we can put any 5 people in the same space and call it a community, right? But to live intentionally in community, to intentionally build community, to want that to be something sustainable that's not going to collapse because, 2 people had a fallout or somebody had a bad day and was kind of rude. I mean, hopefully we can work through that a little bit better, but very often that's what we see, right? Like we see people trying to come in together as community members and then fall apart because something wasn't working. And in fact, that's what a lot of the previous experience of this land project was. It was people coming together with shared vision, but then some of the practices didn't necessarily continue to support that, or there wasn't full value alignment in some ways, and there has been a lot of fallout and relationship disruption previously here. And so part of our time period during this interim is really focusing on what does it look like to foster culture that is going to support relationship and not deteriorate relationship, right? Because to live intentionally in community requires a lot of self-reflection, a lot of self-exploration, and a lot of desire and willingness to show up and do that kind of work, of looking at like what are all the ways that we project our own stuff onto other people, right? Like, ooh, that's so deep in this society. We're really entrenched with concepts surrounding codependency. A lot of that stems from the ways we're taught about our romantic relationships and what those are supposed to look like, but it trickles out into friendships and other dynamics as well. That's definitely a lifelong struggle I've had of like how to be responsible for my own experience, right? And not making it about like, well, this person did this or this person thinks this thing about me, and so therefore I can't be okay, or I'm not gonna be okay, or I'm not okay, or whatever. And a lot of that's embedded in the ways that we're raised. I think some of it links to, this notion of perfectionism, which is also a struggle of mine, and I know a challenge of a lot of yours who watch this channel as well. Having to show up in relationship a certain way, having to have a mask on to not show weakness or fear, or let other people know we're struggling, or trying to make other people comfortable too, right? Like wearing a mask to make other people comfortable. If you are queer or have had any part of your identity that you've either had to or just did suppress or hide from other people, you know what that's like. Like that's a huge weight, even when maybe you don't even realize you're wearing a mask. That was true in my experience. I didn't even realize I was wearing a straight mask until much later on in my life. But a lot of that again dated back to patterns that were established in early childhood of having to show up and be a certain way in order to be good, in order to be good enough, instead of just being able to authentically be who we are and having that be enough. So a lot of these aspects of relationships are things that we've been socialized through society, through lessons we're either intentionally or unintentionally, consciously or unconsciously taught in society. A lot of our own personal experiences, a lot of our social traumas that play out in the education systems when we're children and young adults and moving through those processes. A lot of what I've realized about relearning relationships is it can come down to safety. It can come down to how do we create space in which we feel safe to show up, in which we feel safe to share our emotional experience and take responsibility for that too, again. So it's definitely another lesson I've been learning as well, is just this relearning of relationships is also really hard. It's really emotional work. Learning how to live sustainably around other people, learning how to even show up authentically around other people on a daily basis. For some of y'all, maybe that comes naturally. My sense is for a lot of us, we struggle with that in some way or the other. You know, maybe we're able to do it with some individual people, or maybe not even that yet. But very often when we're in a group, when we're in a situation where we feel more social pressure, it can be more of a challenge for us to feel safe being fully authentic, to feel safe feeling our emotions even. And it requires a lot of unlearning, a lot of self-reflection, a lot of going back through what are the ways we've been conditioned, what are the ways I've been conditioned to think about myself, to think about other people, and how do I let go of some of that? How do I go back and heal some of those childhood wounds that taught me who I wasn't good enough, and I had to put on this mask or be this certain person, or be the good girl in order to receive love, receive acceptance, receive validation that I was okay, right? Like those are a lot of times rooted in historical traumas that it's an emotional journey to work through. I want to end on a tone of a couple practices that I'm seeing, or report back to you, I guess, and a couple pieces that I'm seeing and intrigued by in terms of these like relational dynamics of what does it look like to coexist better together. We are in such an age of division. That was part of what drove me to community as the answer, because to me it feels like the antidote to a lot of the chaos that we're seeing in our social environment right now, that's ultimately rooted in division, rooted in things that have and are sometimes intended to divide us in really harmful, brutal ways. And looking at how do we come together and heal from the ways that we've been divided, either because of race, of gender, of socioeconomic status, of geography, of nationality. There's a lot of ways that we are divided in this society by what we choose to do for work, by personal beliefs and philosophies that we might adhere to. In order for us to move on from the level, or move out of the level of polarization that we see around us, you know, this is what we have to learn. We have to learn how to come together and truly coexist, not just like, okay, you go over there and I'll go over here and we'll pretend that neither one of us exists, and like you do your thing and leave me alone and we'll be fine. That's not how it's going to work. We have to be able to connect. We have to be able to open up to one another, and we have to be able to find those common threads that bring us as humans together, because they exist. There's so many of them that exist, but very often it feels like we're too focused on the things that don't bring us together, and that divide us, and that's just going to further increase the division. So for me, community is in big part about looking for what are those commonalities, what are the common parts that bring us together, and how do we center that and build from that and grow from that and allow ourselves to be changed by that, because that's the beauty of connecting with people who are different from us. That was my experience. That's how I got to this point, is I allowed myself to open and recognize like all the differences that were around me, and instead of focusing on those differences as preventing me from connecting with other people, I was able to find commonality in the differences, to find common feelings and emotions and mirrored experiences in those differences, and how can that bring us together? Like, how can my experiences and your experiences bring us together so that you can learn from me and I can learn from you? And I've seen such growth and healing happen for myself and for other people when those kinds of opportunities are presented. So there's a couple opportunities that I'm seeing and exploring right now that are exciting to me. One of them is like conscious practices, just conscious community practices. One of the folks who lives here with me is really passionate about community cohesion practices, and some of this is rooted back in radical fairy culture and queer culture. A couple of the practices that we've utilized here, one of them that I've seen utilized that we haven't as a small team yet, although I think there's intention for us to do so, is a thing called the heart circle. Heart circle is where people gather in a circle, and everyone shares what is on their heart right then. What is on your heart? And so it can be an opportunity to express gratitude, express emotion, express pain, really just whatever is weighing on you right in that moment. But it's an opportunity for connection, right? It's an opportunity to hear and connect with other people in their life experiences, to practice those empathy skills of connection, and then to practice speaking our own truth about, here's what's going on for me right now, here's how I'm feeling, here's what I'm excited about or struggling with, or feeling lost within, or feeling really enthused about. It's an opportunity to practice vulnerability and to be received, to be seen by community in this container that's been created to offer safe and supportive sharing. Another community cohesion practice that we've used more recently is something called a clearing circle. And how we used a clearing circle was when one person, a member of our team, had some difficult feelings that they needed to express to another person who was on our team. And, you know, our inclination as humans can be to just like be kind of bitter and gossipy about it, and like, oh, that person over, when we're upset with someone, right? Like that can sometimes be our tendency to resort to like tell other people that we're upset with this person, but not actually tell the person we're upset with them. It also can be like a cultural thing. Like I think of the Midwest, there's a big cultural emphasis on being polite, and it's not really polite to tell somebody like, hey, I didn't like that you did this thing, or you hurt my feelings. So being non-direct can create these, like, again, divisions between us and prevent us from being able to connect, or even being able to like each other, right? Like if we let things go unfestered for too long, it can result in us really like not even liking other people. And it's difficult when we're not taught how to engage in conflict in a healthy, productive way. It's difficult to know what to do with those feelings. So a clearing circle is, again, like a container, a safe space that's designed to help express how someone is feeling. And not that this is always going to go perfectly, but it's intended to be an opportunity to just say like, hey, here's what's going on for me, here's what I'm feeling, what are you feeling, and have a dialogue back and forth a little bit in a structured sort of way about what it was that happened. So we had the opportunity to engage in a clearing circle where one person was able to share with another person, hey, here are some things that happened, and here's how it made me feel, and I wanted you to know. And that was the purpose of it, and that's the practice. And again, it was held in community, so there's this intention and focus on not like shaming anyone or making anyone feel bad for their behavior, but to instead provide support and to provide a level of accountability in some ways, and just to be able to hold witness to one another in doing difficult, vulnerable work. I also more personally have been looking into the notion of relationship anarchy, which is a phrase that I believe was coined by a queer feminist out of Sweden whose name is Andy Nordgren. And they have, if you just Google Relationship Anarchy Manifesto, you'll find some of Andy's writings on this, which it's essentially bringing a political edge to the way that we do relationships. So primarily romantic relationships, although there's a way to extend this to any of our relationships, really. Relationship anarchy is the notion of taking a look at the ways that relationships have been politicized, how we're taught that relationships should be, and instead of just kind of going with the status quo that we've been programmed to think this is what a relationship is and has to look like, it involves critically questioning those components and instead exploring, like, what do I actually want? Like, aside from what I've been taught to believe, aside from what everyone has told me a relationship is and what love is, like, what feels good to me? And more importantly, what feels good to me and this other person that I'm with, because that is going to be different for every person we might come into contact with, right? Like, that's going to be a unique combination of the two people who are involved in the equation. So it's sort of like, instead of taking this one size fits all approach that we tend to have in society when it comes to relationships, what does it look like to creatively co-create the experience together in a different way? So that's where the anarchy piece comes into play, because it's about pushing back on the social conditioned ways we're taught to think about relationships, where if you fall in love with somebody, then that's your monogamous life partner, and you're gonna move in together after a certain amount of time, and you're gonna get married after a certain amount of time, you're gonna be together forever, maybe have children, have white picket fence, have a dog, etc., etc., etc. Very sort of American dream. The concept of marriage itself, very, again, like it's a white settler colonizer. It's part of that value system. It's been used to oppress queer people for a very long time, been used to oppress people of color, been used to oppress women. Marriage as an institution has a really yucky sort of history rooted in oppression. So relationship anarchy in part is pushing back against the concept of marriage, but also more generally, like, all the sort of subtle ways that, again, we're taught that a relationship should look and be. So I'm exploring this right now with one individual, and it's been really interesting to sort of like flesh that out, and especially for me personally, looking at the ways that things like codependency and caregiving and saviorship can show up in relationship dynamics. And that's a tough one for a lot of us, like empath, helper, social worker type people, which is probably most of you who are watching this video, especially if you made it to this point. Those behavior characteristics are often, like, it's a blessing and a curse, right? Like, it often drives us to want to do really beautiful work and beautiful things for other people, but it can show up and trickle out in a lot of our relationships and friendships and in romantic relationships and any other kind of relationships we may hold. And I can look at my history and see that as very true. So relationship anarchy and this practice of relationship anarchy is like, how do we engage in a loving, open, and it can totally be a committed relationship dynamic without placing rules, restrictions, ownership, boundaries upon one another, where you have to do this because that's what a relationship is, or you owe me this because this is who I am to you. And instead, what would it look like to be two free beings who come together and share in relationship and work actively against those sorts of old narratives of codependency, of ownership, of you are responsible for the way that I feel, you are my one true life partner, etc. So to me, sort of another conscious practice of taking back ourselves and moving out of systems of oppression is looking at the ways that we show up in relationship. How are we showing up with the people in our worlds? How are we showing up in community? And how are we showing up in our intimate relationships, whether they're romantic and sexual or not? To me, relationship anarchy is a concept that can be an antidote to some of those caregiver, codependent sorts of style dynamics. And it, again, is really emotionally laborious. A lot of emotional labor has been my theme of this year, and a lot of these decision pathways. And yet it is a huge opportunity, I think, to practice healing, to focus on healing, to prioritize our healing and the healing of people and relationship. And again, it's a way of bringing us closer together instead of all these things and pieces that divide us, which is like, here's the issue with the way that we're taught to believe about relationship is it's all or nothing then, right? Like it's all or nothing then. And that's devastating. Like it's devastating to have this level of commitment with someone where you are getting married or you are whatever, like forming these, like we are this monogamous couple who are everything to each other and you're my primary person and you're my primary person. It's devastating when that no longer works, and then it's an all or nothing thing, and so then like the only option is for it to be nothing. And that's something I personally have gone through this last year is what it can look like when a dynamic is created like that, when the dynamic is no longer possible to maintain and sustain the way that you may have envisioned it, to then lose it completely is it can be really damaging for everybody involved. And so what could it look like instead of continuing to replicate these relationship patterns where we place so much expectation and pressure on the other person to be everything for us, then it eventually blows up. And just look at the divorce rates in this country. I mean, I don't even need to tell you to look at it. Like we all know, the divorce rates in this country are astronomical. Because there's something inherently not right with the way that we're trying to bridge some of those pieces together. So part of the reason why I'm speaking openly about this is because I feel that these sorts of concepts, regardless of how you might align with the specifics of relationship and anarchy, if that's something that resonates for you or not, these concepts are still things that can get us thinking differently and moving out of things that aren't working, moving out of relationship dynamics that aren't working in a lot of ways, whether it's an interpersonal two-person dynamic or the ways that we as a society are navigating race relationships on a national level. There are a lot of things that aren't working in terms of how we are trying and failing to connect with one another. And so to me, it's exciting to be exploring these other possibilities and opportunities. A lot of people are talking about rebuilding relationships and doing things differently. And to me, that's a huge opportunity for us in the future. So, you know, maybe your lifestyle right now isn't one where you're going to take off in your vehicle or buy and renovate a van and hit the road. And that's totally okay. Like, this is not for everybody. This lifestyle is challenging in a lot of regards. But there are other ways, right? Like there are other smaller steps we can take. And I don't even want to say smaller. There are other just different steps that we can take to navigate things differently, to show up differently in our relationships, to do some of that emotional labor of unlearning what are the pieces that are not me? What are the pieces that society put on me that no longer fit, that no longer serve, that I no longer want to hold on to? And how do I walk out of those? And that can look a lot of different ways. So I want to encourage you, like, yes, the work is hard. Walking out is hard. It's emotional. It is, it's one of those, like, I remember, you know, sitting in elementary school and watching the clock tick when it was like school was like almost going to be done, and you're like waiting and waiting and waiting, and 5 minutes feels like a lifetime. You know, sometimes it feels like that too when we're moving through these difficult emotions. It feels like it's taking a lifetime to get through this, but that doesn't mean that that's true. Healing work is deep work, and there is light on the other side. So I want to encourage you. I want to encourage all of you walkouts who are thinking about how to do things differently and how to show up more authentically in your life, and what are things that you can tweak and change and make better, not just for yourself, but for all of us, for humanity. Keep exploring those things. Don't shy away from the tough questions or the hard choices, and let yourself feel the feelings. Do what you need to for yourself. It's a process. Rebuilding and unlearning is a huge task that I feel very strongly that we are in a time period right now where we need so much of that. So if you're showing up and doing that in any capacity, just know, like, you are not alone. We are in this together. There's so many of us who are doing this too. And we're going to be strong in that, right? Like, we're going to be strong in that. This is what's needed to shift the way things have been into the way things will be. We are the ones we've been waiting for. I can't end with a better quote than that. Again, a lot more to say in future videos. I can't promise when the next video will be, but I will look forward to sharing more with you all then. Much love. Bye-bye.